it that you need most that CEPI can help bring to push this forward?
I think what CEPI does for all of the vaccine companies, and the 6 of the companies who joined in to CEPI, I think all feel very much the same way. Planning, prioritization, and a mechanism to essentially create increased capacity in the space of research into these rare, unusual, but potentially deadly pathogenic threats. So if you think about what happens in an epidemic or a pandemic situation, first of all, there's almost no spare capacity in the global vaccine industry. If you walk around any of our vaccine plants, they are running full on. All the lines are busy because the world is growing. There is more and more need for vaccine. So the red phone rings, and it's the WHO saying there's a crisis and we need an Ebola vaccine. Immediately after the WHO rings, a couple of countries start ringing to say we want this vaccine now. That's an almost impossible situation for a company to try and to react to. So, and it's so disorganized because actually the world doesn't know if there's a vaccine candidate ready. They don't know whether there's any capacity lined up ready to go. The companies aren't anticipating that phone call. And what CEPI starts to do is to take the kind of things where we've had to react in the middle of the battle of the epidemic and take those things back to peacetime so that we can start to resolve these issues, start to say, yes, we're not perfect, we haven't got perfect foresight, but we can more or less estimate that from these 12 potential pathogens, there's a reasonable chance one of them could be the next pandemic. So let's start working on them. It doesn't mean we're going to get everything right, but let's at least start working. How do we start to think about taking vaccine candidates through to the end of phase 2 so that when a pandemic starts, instead of discussing and debating how to do a phase 2 trial, we go straight to phase 3. Those are the sorts of progress points we can make. Why is that sensible for us? Because at the end of the day, when it really boils down to it, the only people who are going to make a vaccine for the world are the 6 vaccine manufacturers. And so it's in our interest to make this situation much less stressful, much easier for us to react to without disrupting all of the other day-to-day vaccine manufacturers. Because we were very close, I think, in the 3 companies who were most advanced in Ebola. If it had indeed got worse, we would have all been put in the very difficult position of saying, do we make Ebola vaccine at scale or do we make rotavirus vaccine or another vaccine? And then the world is making a completely invidious choice, which could have been avoided. And that's why we're so supportive of CEPI, and I think all 6 companies who are represented here today have worked very, very well to help bring this to fruition.
So CEPI will mean that for a certain number of pathogens, there will be vaccines at the beginning of stage 2 trials. Now, I guess then for me, the question is, money is not limitless. What is and you mentioned this was in some sense self-interest insurance, you're buying insurance. What is the right level of insurance to buy? How many vaccines how many pathogens should you go after, and what should the scale of this be? You're clearly just starting, this is a very big start, but how do you think of that? And Bill Gates, I'm looking at you because I know that you think in these terms. So what's the ambition in terms of what's the right number to go after or the right scale of this?
The number of potential pathogens out there is far greater than we're likely to do specific constructs for. So, maybe if we're lucky, we can cover the things that are 50% or 60% of the risk. Flu is kind of a special one that we should just go and do. But even putting that aside, there'll be some predictability. And even the surprising ones will have may have some relationship so that you're able to just change the vaccine modestly, particularly with these new platforms. Ideally, I think we do 5 or 6. At our current funding level, it's more likely that we'll be able to do 2 or 3. But there are some major actors who will participate in this space, including the UK and the US and China, who, whether they come into CEPI formally or they simply take their programs and make sure that they're complementary, like the US BARDA investments, this endeavor will be bigger than the CEPI organization itself. And I'd say broadly, maybe we will get the 10 or so that I think would be attractive. Once we get to 10, then I think the global health community should have a great debate about should we do 11 or 12? Did it go as quickly as we want? At least we will have exercised the, how do you go to the regulator and what do you do about stockpiles? Things, you wouldn't believe every question that should have been resolved in advance of the Ebola epidemic was not resolved in advance. In fact, we can still sort of debate some of these things about trial design that the CEPI construct will force the dialogue to continue and even to be more prepared.
Prime Minister Solberg.
Well, I think I just follow up on the last part there, because besides actually working on concrete vaccines, it's also important to have that discussion on how do we have preparedness for scaling up, how do we have a priority on how we do it. You can do all those discussions that can take lengthy time. When the problem arises, you can do it in forefront, you can have a scheme, you can have an international discussion on the priorities that you are making in a crisis like this, because you are already there seeing the problems that will arise. Well, so I think it's important to say, yes, it's a workable, it's an initiative for innovation on vaccines, but it's also a way of having somebody pushing this agenda so that we discuss how we are better prepared in the future. And I think that is needed because there's so many problems. It's overwhelming in a lot of bodies, also in the World Health Organization, that you should deal with. So maybe there have to be somebody who is advocating and pushing this agenda.
Jeremy.
Yeah, it's unusual for me to quote Donald Rumsfeld, but I think he sometimes did frame some things sensibly. You have the known pathogens that Bill was talking about, and for a world not to be prepared for the known pathogens that could cause an epidemic is unacceptable. And that's honestly the situation we're in today. And CEPI will address that issue. But I think CEPI will do far more than that. My hope is it actually catalyzes a new partnership. And in these cynical times, I think a global partnership with the various players in CEPI coming together is actually a real sense of optimism and hope. And I think that's very important. But it will also catalyze the whole technological advance. Bill talked about RNA and DNA technologies for vaccines, of platform approaches, so that we're not reinventing a new vaccine approach every time an unknown pathogen comes. But I think CEPI has to earn you have to earn the right to exist first, and you have to earn respect first. And that's why it's critical that CEPI chooses 1, 2, 3, 4 vaccines, and in the next few years absolutely delivers on those, including, in my view, finishing the job on Ebola. We have a safe and effective vaccine for Ebola, and we actually have more than one candidate. Johnson & Johnson, GSK, Merck, all have very good candidates. But we don't have a licensed vaccine. That has to be finished. We have to be able to have a licensed vaccine that could be used tomorrow when the inevitable epidemic of Ebola comes back.
So the central focus of CEPI will be getting the vaccines and getting the vaccines to the second stage. But as you've all mentioned, there are things beyond that. There's improving distribution schemes, and then presumably there's also something about streamlining regulatory approval. I mean, isn't part of the problem, or wasn't part of the problem, the difficulty of having the time it takes to get regulatory approval? So, Andrew, let's start with you there. Do you think CEPI can play an important role in these things that are sort of essentially outside the lab, if you will?
Yeah, and I think really it's to the point that Bill just made. And what CEPI does is it takes something which historically, in between pandemics, has been treated as a theoretical debate and makes it very crystallized. So if we're working on a MERS vaccine, we can actually sit down with the regulators right now and say, okay, if we have a MERS vaccine which is based on this platform, what do you want to know to discharge your anxieties of safety and the like, and quality? Those debates, it wasn't really about timeline to get regulatory approval. It was having the argument over what is the question you are going to ask in the first place? I'll never forget in September of the Ebola pandemic, being in Geneva, listening to global regulatory organizations argue with each other over the heads of the industry and the countries involved, whether or not the trials should be placebo-controlled or not. That debate could have and should have happened years in advance, and there should be a pandemic response kit which says, right, we go to phase 3 with this candidate, we've all agreed this is the basis. Liability the same. We still don't have a practical solution for global deployment of emergency vaccines from a liability point of view. And while some people will say, well, how important is that? The reality is, when you take what will always be, even after CEPI, essentially an extremely accelerated development program, and you deploy in an emergency situation, you will find private sector companies reluctant to embark on an open-ended global liability risk. We all know that. The American government resolved it with the PrEP Act years ago, but the rest of the world hasn't moved. Those are the sorts of things which I hope won't be done by CEPI, but in a way CEPI takes away the excuse not to talk about it, because what CEPI does is it turns the theoretical into real, and then everybody around the real issue has to start to step forward with their resolutions. And I think then you start to deliver something much more comprehensive in terms of pandemic readiness.
So it's at the very least the right people around the table with the right incentives to make sure that before the pandemic hits, you actually have some of this stuff worked out.
I just want to make one other slightly more technical point, if I can. If this works the way I think we all hope it works, it's a network. And the way I like to think about CEPI from the manufacturing point of view, it's a network of volunteers, first of all, who volunteer into the network their whatever capability, knowledge that they feel that's relevant and they feel willing to volunteer. If that works effectively, that creates the most extraordinarily novel open innovation environment. And what we're really potentially buying here is not insurance for the first time, but ultra-high quality insurance in a way which we have not been able to do in the past. And I don't think we should lose sight of the novelty of how that network could work together if this plays out the way we hope it does.
Mr. President, let me bring you into the discussion here. What would you we've heard now various different ways in which CEPI will move things forward, particularly in vaccine preparedness. What would you hope that it brings? What would you want it to achieve so that it really changes on the ground the environment you face?
Well, first of all, we'd like better collaboration with the government. Vaccinations, of course, but prevention is even better. Certainly in Africa, if we see epidemics develop, well, that's essentially down to an ineffective health system. So we need to improve the health system, and that can be done through better research. If we take the case of Ebola in Guinea, we weren't quick enough in analyzing the strain to see that it was Ebola. It wasn't until it got to Conakry that we were able to get in touch with the Pasteur Institute and find out actually what it was. It was far too slow, so we need support in that regard. And we need to ensure not only that it is a high level in densely populated areas, but that it reaches right down out into remote areas as well, so that there can be very quick response throughout the country. So yes, we want better vaccinations, but we believe that with a high-performing health system, it won't then be necessary for people to send us international experts, etc. We would be able to take care of it ourselves on the ground. And that, for us, is better. Obviously, it's great if people come and help us, but it would be even better if we could do it ourselves within the capability of our own healthcare system. Thank you.
Jeremy, how is CEPI planning to work with agencies on the ground, with the rest of the infrastructure that exists?
Yeah, I think, again, it goes back to one of the strengths of CEPI, and as you can imagine, over the last year, there's been quite heated debate at various times. There's people coming from a very different perspective, but particularly following on from Ebola and what the President just said, countries in West Africa have been involved in all of these discussions. We've been fortunate to have Médecins Sans Frontières as a member of civic society there and often at the front line of the epidemics. And I think all of the partners have absolutely bought into the idea of the technological advances, the regulatory environment that we've heard changing, and the actual making of vaccines. But there's another piece which is, I think, critically important to all of us, and it's not just the foundations. And that is that ultimately CEPI also has to deliver vaccines to the world and make them accessible, independent of people and countries' ability to pay for them. And the public-private partnership, as well as with WHO on board, is absolutely committed to make sure that we make those vaccines available and affordable to everybody that needs them. And that's a core principle of CEPI, which all of us have signed up to.
So that's within CEPI's remit to ensure that.
Wellcome Trust, and I'm sure the Foundation would not be part of this if that were not true.
And from the industry's perspective, Andrew?
Yeah, no, we've made it very clear, so I speak for GSK specifically, that we're engaging in this on a cost coverage basis. So we're not looking at a kind of no gain, no loss basis. It's up to each individual company to think about how it engages. Obviously, it's not for any given company or entity to dictate terms, but certainly from our perspective, we think that's the right basis to go forward. And we're looking forward to activating, essentially. We think there's significant benefit for everybody here. We think it's right for patients, we think it's right for countries, we think it's right to streamline and simplify this space, and as a consequence, it's good for us because it's going to take away the disruption risk for us, and it's going to mean that when the phone does ring, we can say yes, more often than we would otherwise be able to do.
So this is, I mean, as you've now heard in very illuminating detail, an extraordinary initiative, but I would not be doing my job as a skeptical journalist if I didn't ask you about what are the potential risks, what are the potential downsides, what's the danger that this becomes a well-meaning talking shop, but it doesn't actually achieve very much. So Bill Gates, let's start with you. What worries you, if anything, about CEPI actually achieving what it set out to do? Is it that not enough people will cough up? Is it that the admirable partnership here that exists on this stage will break down? Is it that the incentives won't be right? What are the biggest concerns, do you think?
I still think we need to do more about epidemics, and the president talked about investments in high-quality health care for normal diseases being a piece of that. Very specialized surveillance, where when you see unusual circumstance, you have sophisticated labs nearby. That there are some initiatives like one called CHAMPS that we're working on that will bring a piece of that, but still not cover it fully. So my greatest concern is that if people think, oh, we have CEPI, therefore this epidemic thing, we solve that. Even a straightforward thing like how we get probably Gavi to buy the stockpile, how big the stockpile should be. We haven't worked that out. Now, I think that piece actually will be fairly straightforward because Gavi is amazing, one of the best things we've done. Countries, including all the supporters here of CEPI, have been generous enough with Gavi that I think we do have the resources there for the stockpile. The diagnostics will be very important. When you're in an epidemic, the idea of who's infected and who's not infected, if you can't tell, then your whole quarantine thing gets you into these very tough situations. The countries were given very contradictory advice about what to do about quarantine because we didn't have a diagnostic at first. Even then when we finally got it, it was still a fairly complex machine that took too long to get the results from. So my main worry, yes, there's still some scientific risk on these new platforms, but my main worry is that the world will still fall short of taking care of epidemic response.
Prime Minister Solberg, how do you share that concern, and how will you make sure that Norway is pushing everyone else to make sure that CEPI is not you say, tick, we've done enough now we can stop worrying?
Well, we are planning to use our best people on this to work with CEPI to make sure that we put a focus on finding the good solutions. It might be challenging that maybe there will be other bodies who should have taken more care of that, who have not done that, and they will now take one step even further behind. I think it's important that we also see that there's a responsibility for us all to push this on the World Health Organization's agenda, to make sure that, because that's the platform where you can have all the governments, all the health authorities around the world to operate together on how you deal with this when the crisis comes. Because you have to go from step 2 towards, in fact use the vaccine, make sure. And then, of course, when there's no need of, if there's not a feeling of emergency, things take often too long time. And that's also a challenge in this. I mean, The regulatory system, yes. We are good at bending all of those regulatory systems when people are dying. But when we are just thinking about the potential of people are dying, then maybe the whole regulatory system will be going too slow. So I think there is that might lead to having an organization and having a work and a cooperation and coalition on this, but not being, not reaching the time limit for the next epidemic, which we should try to do.
Jeremy, how do you maintain that sense of urgency? What is on, what should be and what is on CEPI's to-do list in the next, let's say, year or two?
So CEPI's already, there's a long list of potential pathogens and there's a short list, and CEPI's quite rightly said we're going to focus on some initial pathogens because they may not be the right pathogens to focus on, let's be honest. But what any new organization needs to do is to earn the right to exist. And I think by focusing in the next 1 to 2 years on delivering on those promises that have been made, there's nothing better than getting support than if you're successful. And if we do that in the next 1 to 3 years, I believe, and having watched the history of Gavi's development and the amazing contribution it's made, then the world will really get behind and back it. So I think the most important thing to do is focus on what it's setting out to achieve transparently and delivering on that. And the greatest risk? The greatest risk is to do what we did after SARS, and that's to forget it and move on.
But if the metric of success is to bring vaccines for these 3 pathogens that you've identified, those pathogens, heaven forbid, hopefully will not be the basis of the next epidemic. So it will still be preventative. It will still be, insurance. How will you ensure that you maintain the political momentum to say, this is really something we need to keep pushing for when your output is hopefully something that will never be used? Oh, yes.
Can I start by, that's where I have this special interest in the combination of this towards the whole change of antibiotics now. Because we need more vaccines because antibiotics will not function in the same way in the future. And the British government made an estimate that in 2040-50, there will be more people dying because of antibiotics that are not functioning and of the old diseases than there are people dying of cancer. So this is an agenda that will move forward because it interlinks between. If you get the flu, yes, you can do a lot of work and you can work on antibiotics to make sure that people are getting cured, but a lot of people will die if you have more resistant antibiotics. So I think we have to see that this fits into also this big agenda that the UN discussed at a summit in September, and which is going to be an increasing big problem for us.
Jeremy, you were.
Well, one thing that this doesn't directly address is bioterrorism, intentionally caused epidemics. And so the broader agenda for governments is going to have to include that. In fact, I'll be at the Munich Security Conference next month, and this idea that some of these investments that are made for the diseases that are already out there, the likely case for epidemics, and what preparedness would look like for the intentionally caused things, that needs to be discussed. It's very hard to rate the probability of bioterrorism, but the potential damage is very, very huge. And CEPI, I think appropriately, is not in that space. We've got very finite resources, but some of the governments that are in and some that are not in, I'm hoping over the next few years there's some substantial investments.
CEPI will catalyze that in part, even though it's not in that space itself. It will help frame and catalyze.
Yes,
that
and some of these platforms are exactly what you would do if your only goal was to create some protection there. These platforms are very helpful. So the two things relate, but we do not say this is a solution for that.
Jeremy, you wanted to add something?
Yeah, I think what is also critical is, and CEPI has a crucial role in this, and that is to maintain the sense of urgency and be a focal point for some of these discussions. And, you know, as the World Health Organization is strengthening its epidemic preparedness, as the World Bank is playing an increasing role to ensure there's financing, as Gavi is involved, I mean, these players have all been part of this CEPI initiative. So, you know, if we move on after the horrors of what we went through in Ebola, then that would be the greatest mistake. I think this is the chance, having had numerous warnings over the last 12 years, and the coming together of many people in this room and around this plenary now, I think this is the moment to change things. And the commitment from Norwegian government, Gates Foundation, industry, Wellcome Trust, etc., has been staggering.
One question that may seem to go back to the beginning of our discussion, but it's one that I think is important, is how do you, and you've all come together and it's extraordinarily impressive, how do you actually decide which pathogen you're going to go take first? How, when you had that discussion around the table, you've got limited resources, Andrew, how do you choose them?
Well, no, what CEPI does is rely on an independent scientific advisory board. So that, I mean, it's really important to understand that. This isn't the vaccine companies cooking up in a corner with Jeremy and Bill. Let's do what we can do. This is coming much more from an independent scientific advisory group who look at the potential threats, look at the likelihoods, look at the various pathogens which are out there, and starts to prioritise those. Then essentially what CEPI will do is issue requests to the world, essentially. You don't have to be a member of CEPI, but essentially to say to people who've got research capacity in these fields, have you got technology capability which could be put to bear on MERS or on Nipah or on Lassa or whatever it is? And then that's what starts to populate the knowledge base and the research capability, and hopefully we see some significant progress. And I think a lot of really good work was done at the very beginning of this to make sure that there was a really strong independence created around the scientific decision-making and prioritization setting.
And as the last set of questions that I'm going to ask each of you, I'd like you to look forward and do a little bit of prediction in slightly different ways each. And Andrew, I'm going to start with you. If we meet again, well, we will meet again this time next year, what will you hope CEPI has achieved?
In 1 year? Mm-hmm. I think in 1 year that we would have successfully initiated on at least one, if not two, pathogens, that we would have, life wouldn't be perfect, but we would have got into a rhythm of learning very quickly. So I think we have to be realistic, and one of the things I like about CEPI is we haven't waited for perfection before we've begun. Everybody's gone into this with a sense of optimism, but taking a bit of risk. We're all putting our business models a little bit in play here, and that's required. So we need to learn as we go through this year. What I hope a year from today, we've got work in progress on one or two pathogens, that we're feeling like we're making progress, that we're feeling like we're building scientific synergy somehow in the program, and we're beginning to spin off challenges to organizations, functions outside of CEPI that others have to start responding to, and they indeed start responding because they believe there's some credibility around CEPI.
That's a very concrete to-do list. Bill Gates, I'm going to ask you to look a little further ahead in the crystal ball. 5 years.
Well, with any luck, in a 5-year time frame, the initial 2 or 3 projects would have had success. That is, we see the correlates that we hope to see, and in many cases, we will have chosen to stockpile those things, and so we will really be ready, particularly if we do complementary work on a diagnostic and we improve these surveillance networks. We will be far more ready than we are today.
And